Hello and welcome back to AP World History Modern. Today we're going to begin day 5 of Unit 5.2, focusing in on nationalism and nationalism as an overarching concept. All right. So just as a kind of reminder of where nationalism comes from, nationalism comes from, let's kind of move on, the Napoleonic years, right? The Napoleonic Wars. And, an argument can definitely be made that we start to see the rise of nationalism, during the era of the French Revolution. We do have writers, or, we do have some primary sources out there that talk about the veracity in which French forces fought, against the other forces from surrounding monarchs. And of course the ideals of the French Revolution as as Napoleon makes his way across Europe. Once the Napoleonic Empire collapses and, national boundaries are redrawn again by the Congress of Vienna, that is not going to, remove that influence, right? So we start to see a couple major forces come into play here in Europe at the conclusion of the Napoleonic era. And these are forces that had definitely existed before the Napoleonic years. Obviously, we first reference the creation of political parties and these political ideological movements. I referenced them as far back as the English Civil War. The Roundheads versus the Cavaliers. It's kind of the beginning of this. And of course, the Enlightenment is all about ideologies and what is the real purpose of government, what role should government have in society, but we start to see these ideas become fully flushed out by the time we get to the end of the Napoleonic era, right? So let's take the ideas of classical liberalism, the political philosophy or ideology founded on individual liberties, equality, regardless of social class, and of course the ideologies of conservatism. So classical liberalism and conservatism within the context of the early 1800s should not be confused with the use of these political ideological terms today. Very, very different terms, right? So this promotion of retaining traditional roles and hierarchies, and most importantly, monarchs, right? At this particular time in Europe, right? So church, classical liberalism is more focused on expanding the franchise, kind of pushing towards, throughout the 1800s, a movement towards universal male suffrage. And eventually once we get into the 20th century, then the franchise will be expanded into, to allow women. So universal suffrage, right, it will be a 20th century thing. 20th century goal, and universal male suffrage will be a goal of the 19th century of classical liberalism. Support of the crown, monarchs, pro-monarchy, definitely a component of conservatism in the 19th century. Liberalism, this John Locke idea of freedom of speech as a key component of self-governing. I've also Voltaire advocated such things, right? So, social hierarchies, is the retention of those is definitely a component of conservatism, and to a degree, classical liberalism as well. I think it's no oversimplification not to say that. Free press, right? A free and open press, a free and fair press, definitely something we advocate, we associate with classical liberalism. All right. So whether, when we talk about, nationalism or we talk about governance, governance, from the Napoleonic era on, we're talking about a rise in something known as nationalism. A form of patriotism based on the identification of a group or individual within a nation, not widespread until following the French Revolution. Of course, that is Delacroix's painting, not from the French Revolution. That's an 1830 revolution, but whatever. I can't help myself from saying that every time I see that. People may have been loyal to a city or a leader, but not a nation, right? So the word was coined in the 1770s after the American Revolution. Nationalism will grow out of the idea of this notion of popular sovereignty. So the state is created, sustained by the will of the people. And we see the Atlantic revolutions, right, will be the application of these ideas, right? People take pride in the nation that was theirs, right? They have an actual skin in the game. They have a stake. They have a say, right? It's not being controlled purely by the nobility, right? By the monarchy, right? This kind of notion of patriotism, right? So, this notion of patriotism. So let's play a little example of patriotism. So since we're watching this, and you're a student in the United States, right? Rank your nationalism. Right? What is in your mind? What is the most, right? Kind of the greatest example of American pride. The thing you're most proud of when you think of the United States. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You step close. 7, 8, 9, 10. All right, so which, all right, when you think of nationalism in the United States, which one of those things, in class we would discuss and make our assertion, support it with evidence, why it's more significant than the other, but irregardless, what we're really talking about here is the kind of rise of ideologies, right? The kind of beginning ideology kind of stuff, political thought. And when we talk about the Congress of Vienna returning Europe to conservative rule, people around Europe didn't all just buy into this. And as a result, we're going to see, when you start to cage in these ideas, eventually there's going to be some explosion once the pressure builds. And in 1848 is a great example of a year in which pressure had been building, and then you get the explosion of it in multiple places. Right, so France, riots will eventually lead to the king's abdication, a new constitution, another election, and we see the election of Charles Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, right, aka Napoleon III, right, and right, ultimately that will, right, the revolution itself will be a failure. In 48 in Austria, right, news of France's revolution spread. Riots will lead to the king being replaced. All right, and in initial reforms will eventually all be revoked. In Italy, right, Metternich's fall. In Austria will lead to revolts as well, right, and then the global order, the concert of Europe will succeed here. So the concert of Europe will crush that disharmony. All right. And of course, in Germany, same as Italy, the riots and whatnot are going to get squashed. 1848 is really a huge failure when it comes to revolutions and spreading these classical liberal ideas of self-representation on the continent, right? However, they will give rise to other things, right? So nationalist movements, right? and national movements will also take the form of both classical liberalism and conservatism. It's not all just one. So when we kind of look at some of these are advocating classical liberalism. Some of these nationalist movements are advocating conservatism. And I heard this quote actually recently. I thought it was a pretty interesting one. It goes, from one perspective, ideology is the mechanism that harmonizes the principles that you want to think you hold and what advances your material interests. All right, so it's kind of an interesting idea. All right, so as far as nationalist movements, we're going to look at a couple of case studies. One, of course, is the propaganda movement, right? So the whole Jose Real. And this is a movement that is in the Philippines. And, so the goals of the movement, representation in the Spanish parliament. Right, so they weren't asking for independence per se. They were simply asking for representation. Legal equality of the Spanish, right, or between the Spanish and Filipinos. Public schools are independent of religion, so separation of church and state. An end of forced labor or coerced labor systems. 40 days a year, so a variation of a kind of sounds like a META system. And equal opportunity to enter the government. All right, so we've got a little video on this one here, and so let's slide this on over, and I'm just pulling off from 5.2. So if you'd rather watch it on 5.2, it's down towards the bottom. So if you just pause this video, you can scroll down and watch this. So it's 8 minutes long.
History is full of warriors and generals who led armies in battle and brought down mighty empires. Julius Caesar, Genghis Khan, Napoleon, Lando. Revolutions do more than military.
All right, so I'm just going to stop this since you are literally watching it on the same page. There's no reason why you can't just pause and watch it and then come back. Okay. All right, so pull this off. All right, next case study, the unification of Germany. And the unification of Germany, the rise of nationalism in Germany, right? So Napoleonic Wars put an end to the Holy Roman Empire. And what happens as a result of this, because is it the old Voltaire quote, the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy or an empire, right? Left over 500 individual states, but they share common language, they share common cultural and political background, right? So kind of German-speaking, right? Largely German-speaking people. In the Congress of Vienna will leave Central Europe largely under the Habsburg control. So who's the ultimate person who comes up with the plan, right, and implements the plan for unification? It is Otto von Bismarck, right? So Otto von Bismarck, and he uses, right, his ideas are, they often talk about historical leaders who are playing chess multiple steps ahead of the others. So this idea of realpolitik, right? Practical politics, realistic approach, not following a moral or ethical premise, very, you could call it Machiavellian, the ends justify the means, right? So basing his decisions on the circumstances and what is going to advance his objectives, right? So basically, unification by Bismarck happens as a result of 3 separate wars. One is he actually uses the Habsburgs. So ultimately, when we talk about, unification of Germany, it's largely, just kind of to break this down a little bit. It's largely coming out of this region, right? The area in and around, Berlin, and Habsburgs are the dominant force in Central Europe at this point. And what Bismarck will do is he will utilize the Habsburgs to kind of begin his process. So they secure the northern border, taking some Danish lands, okay? And this is actually with the help of the Habsburgs, of the Austrian-Hungarians. The next thing that happens is the Austro-Prussian War, so where he actually goes up and defeats the Habsburgs. And this is one of those things where he goats the Habsburgs into violating their own their own treaty or a deal, and in doing so creates a justification for invasion. In doing so, right, or in order to do so, he actually manipulates the Italians, right? So it gets Cavour to bring troops near the Habsburg border, Austro-Hungarian border, and then that's going to cause the Habsburgs to raise their military, hence giving Bismarck justification to initiate a war. And from what I've read about this particular war, I'm not going to get into the details of it, but it was definitely a coin flip, right, as far as how things went. But Bismarck won that coin flip, and he's going to once again goat Napoleon III into attacking, and so he creates these scenarios where a war takes place, and and comes out looking as the person who is invaded, right? So the end result of the Franco-Russian War, and this is going to be a complete annihilation. This is not this was not a close battle, a close war, and of course, in doing so, right, in fighting France, he picks up Alsace and Lorraine, and these will become some controversial states that that Prussia picks up, because they'll be taken back by France following World War One. All right, so we see the creation of a unified Germany, officially following the Franco-Prussian War. So 1871 is our official start for Germany under Bismarck. Okay, all right, moving on. Another example of nationalism is the Maoris. All right, so the Maoris, it's got a decent amount on this one here. If you're looking for, if you just kind of pause the video and you look at this call for national unification and liberalism, if you scroll down, I give some kind of depth on this stuff here. And as far as the Maori nationalism, in New Zealand, the wars in New Zealand, I get a kind of a breakdown of the step-by-step of what happens, how this rise of nationalism comes to fruition, the events of it, and of course the results, right? So let's just kind of talk about the effect of the results of this. Large areas of land were confiscated by the Maori by the government of New Zealand Settlements Act in 1863 as a punishment for rebellion, right? Land was confiscated from both loyal and rebel tribes alike. About half of this was subsequently paid for or returned to Maori control, right? But it was often not returned to its original owners. And confiscations have a lasting impact on the social economic developments of the affected tribes. And of course, one of the big effects is the depopulation of the Maori people that happens as a result of the of this entire thing, right? So, and of course, the New Zealand government will eventually apologize, in the early or the mid 1990s. So, since colonialism of New Zealand, the Europeans remarked on the war dance of the Maori, the haka, and of course, the haka is known worldwide because of largely the New Zealand's national team, the All Blacks. Right, so it becomes known globally in '88.
The All Blacks just waiting for the French to peel off the tracksuits, stand in front of them, and receive the challenge of the haka. Well, now the challenge has been received by the French. Stand by, the Rugby World Cup final.
Right, and you know, not history related, but kind of interesting. A little fun fact at the bottom there. There you go. All right, Puerto Rico. All right. And feel free to pause and read through. I do on the, if you look on the website, I do kind of break down, you know, her movement a little bit. So Lola, you know, Lola Rodriguez de Tio, she actually spent some time in the United States. I always kind of find this fascinating. You know, the revolutionaries or nationalists or whatnot who, you know, end up spending time, usually in New York, you know, so you take someone like Fidel Castro, actually lived in New York City. You know, someone like Trotsky lived in New York City. I always kind of find it interesting when one of these nationalist leaders or revolutionary leaders has a New York connection. But yes, so right, national so poet, right, largely, right, a writer, you know, and yeah, it's largely based, or her national anthem is based on her writing. Okay. All right, let's get caught up here. Let's see what I missed. I do have, let me get out of this. I do have a couple other videos that I do show sometimes and explain. You know, that kind of looks at nationalism, you know, as a whole. But I think we're good for today. So let's do a little wrap up because I have a little bit more depth on today's wrap up than normal. All right, so the Congress of Europe resulting from the Congress of Vienna is going to be an attempt to keep forces of nationalism at bay through the 19th century. And there's going to be a lot of give and take here. And obviously the creation of Germany and Italy, and I guess that's probably what I did skip is the Italian unification side of things. Have that up here. Maybe I don't. Maybe I have that on a different slide. Oh yeah, here it is. Just a little bit about this. So Italian unification also takes place during this, you know, during the 1850s and 1860s. So Cavour and you know, to the south, Garibaldi, the red shirts, right? And they will come together and eventually join the Papal States, or bring the Papal States into the fold in 1871. So 1871 is the date for both Germany and Italy being fully unified. Right. So anyway, kind of back to what I was saying, because I hadn't mentioned that before. You know, when we talk about the Congress of Europe, a lot of the idea is to maintain the status quo, prevent these nationalist movements from rising. And in the case of specifically Germany, you're going to have the introduction of a new variable into the equation. You know, so the concert fails, right, in regards to, you know, being able to, you know, prevent the creation of a new nationalist-based government. You know, and of course that variable is gonna be something that plays a major role in the beginning part of the 20th century. Right, but what we're really dealing with here is this idea of a state versus a nation. And I'd like to spend a second just talking about this and kind of pulling off from the Penn State University website here. So we have a definition of what a state is, right? States are tied to territories. States have bureaucracies, right? Stat by their own personnel. States can monopolize certain functions within its territories. Whereas a nation is a group of people who see themselves as a cohesive, coherent unit based on shared cultural and historic hierarchical criteria. Nations are socially constructed units, not given by nature, right? So we live in a state, we're part of a nation, all right? Yes, and then a nation state is the idea of a homogeneous nation governed by its own sovereign state, all right? So you start to have this kind of, furthermore, states are not nations, okay? Not every nation has a state. The Kurds, the Roma, the Palestinians. Some states may contain all or part, right, of multiple nations, right? So, and of course, in the United States, we have different Amerindian or Native American nations inside the state of the United States. If that makes sense, right? So when we're talking about this as a concept, we're really starting to get into the differentiating. We're getting more specific. We're not just talking generalities of empires anymore. All right, states versus nations, and the whether or not these nations are good or bad for a state. Right. So when we talk about nationalism. Right, nationalism in Europe. So why is there a rise? And beyond the French Revolution, there's all kinds of reasons for this. The printing press standardizes language as a whole. Some of these, obviously these unification movements will standardize a language as well. There's a decline in religious identity, and if you have a decline in religious identity, something is going to fill that void. Right, so it's one of those things where if you are not a religious person, well, you're going to believe in something. And, right, so what is that? What are you going to put your faith into? What are you going to worship? All right. And, right, so political upheaval will definitely be, some of the effects of this, and we'll get into examples of that later in the course. Can the rise of nationalism in this kind of focus on the nation, can it be a good thing? And the obvious answer is yes. I can certainly remember high points of nationalism within the United States. In the days and months following the September 11th, 2001 attacks on the United States. It definitely, nationalism was a very palatable thing, and and you could definitely see it. Yeah, it can bring people together. It can tear down gender and economic inequalities. It can and it can also, if you want to look at this from the point of view of like the propaganda movement in the Philippines, it can result in challenging imperial status quos. Can it be bad? And the answer is undoubtedly yes. Right? It can result in increases in racism and factionalism. It can lead to exclusion. There's an entire concept out there known as Balkanization, and Balkanization refers to what was going on in the Balkans, and Balkans is that part of Southeast Europe, that had formerly been under Ottoman control until the end of the 1800s. And Balkanization of any society is, like, when you hear that word being used, that there's a Balkanization going on, that means your society, your nation as a whole, is starting to become smaller nations, right, or less unified. And Balkanization is, very rarely, I don't think I've ever heard it used, to connote positive things. And of course, this will result in imperial challenges. So, and of course, the imperialist reaction to nationalist movements is going to be often brutal, as we saw with the case of the Maori. All right. So that's it for today. A basic introduction to what nationalism is, and and a couple of examples, therein. So please make sure you do watch the little video on the propaganda movement. Let's kind of scroll down. Let me just kind of remind you again where that is. Here we go. Okay. Right. So right here. All right. So go ahead and click on that and watch that if you haven't already. And there's also, there's the regular ones you can watch as well. All right, that is all for today. Sapriati.